On the night of April 14th, 1912, the most famous ship in history was gliding across a silent, freezing ocean. The Titanic was called unsinkable. The lights were warm, the music was playing, and more than 2,000 people believed they were safe. Among them was a young father traveling with his pregnant wife and 2 little daughters, dreaming of a new life. He was not rich. He was not famous, but he carried something stronger than wealth, a deep love for his family and a quiet determination to protect them at any cost. Very few people noticed him. In fact, history almost forgot him completely. He was the only black man on the Titanic. And when disaster struck that night, he made a decision that would change his family's story forever. As the icy water began to swallow the ship, panic spread across the decks. People were running, crying, searching for lifeboats. In the middle of that chaos, this father did one thing first. He made sure his wife and children were safe. He lifted them into a lifeboat with his own hands. He comforted them. He promised he would see them again. But he never stepped in with them. He stayed behind. Why did he do it? What happened in those final moments on the deck? And how did his story remain hidden from the world for more than 80 years? Tonight, we're going to uncover the life, the sacrifice, and the forgotten legacy of the only black man who sailed on the Titanic. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next untold story. And in the comments, tell us where you're listening from, which city and country. Your voice helps keep these forgotten lives remembered. Now, let's go back to the beginning, long before the Titanic ever set sail. On the night of April 14th, 1912, the Atlantic Ocean was calm and dark, stretching endlessly beneath a sky filled with cold, brilliant stars. The Titanic moved steadily forward, cutting through the water with quiet confidence. Inside, the ship was alive with soft laughter, clinking glasses, and the distant sound of music drifting through polished hallways. Families spoke about the future. Children slept peacefully. Many believed they were traveling on the safest ship ever built. Among those thousands of passengers was a young father traveling with his pregnant wife and 2 small daughters. He was not rich. He was not famous. No newspapers followed him. No one stopped to learn his story. Yet his journey, and the decision he would soon make, would become one of the most powerful acts of love hidden within the tragedy of the Titanic. He carried himself with quiet dignity. He spoke gently to his children and stayed close to his wife as they explored the ship together. To most people around him, he was simply another second-class passenger, another man hoping for a better future across the ocean. But inside, he carried a lifetime of struggle, determination, and hope. He was a man who had already crossed oceans once before, a man who had worked hard to build a life in a place where he was often judged before he even spoke, a man who knew what it meant to feel unseen, yet never allowed bitterness to take root in his heart. His greatest pride was not his education or his work. It was his family. That evening, as the ship moved steadily across the cold Atlantic, he watched his daughters laugh at dinner. One of them clutched a small toy in her hands. The other leaned sleepily against her mother's shoulder. His wife, tired from the long journey and the weight of the child she carried, smiled softly across the table at him. In that quiet moment, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Peace. For the first time in years, the future felt close and real. They were traveling toward a new beginning, a new country, a new life. a place where he hoped he could finally build something stable and lasting for the people he loved most. Every decision he had made, every struggle he had endured, had led him to this journey. He did not know that history would almost forget his name. He did not know that decades would pass before the world would hear about him. And he certainly did not know that before the night was over, he would be faced with a moment that would demand everything from him. But long before the Titanic, long before the cold water and the panic and the lifeboats, there was another story, a quieter one. A story that began far from the icy Atlantic, in a warm coastal land where the air carried the scent of salt and sunlight. He was born into a world still shaped by hardship and change. His parents believed deeply in education and discipline. From a young age, he was taught that knowledge could open doors that seemed permanently closed. He was curious, thoughtful, determined. He asked questions about how things worked, how machines moved, how ships crossed oceans. As a boy, he would stand near the water and watch ships come and go, wondering where they were headed and what life looked like in distant places. He dreamed of learning, of building, of becoming someone who could create things that lasted. Those dreams carried him far from home. As he grew older, he left behind the familiar warmth of his childhood and traveled to Europe to study. It was not an easy life. He was far from family, far from comfort, in a place where he often stood out in every room he entered. But he worked harder than most. He studied late into the night. He believed that if he proved himself through discipline and knowledge, doors would open. Sometimes they did. Often they did not. He learned quickly that life could be unfair in quiet ways. Opportunities came slowly. Respect came even slower. But he did not give up. He held on to the belief that one day all the effort would be worth it. And then something happened that changed his life forever. He met a young woman who saw him not for the color of his skin, not for the country he came from, but for the man he was. She saw his kindness, his intelligence, his gentle nature. They spoke for hours. They walked together. They shared dreams of a future filled with stability and family. They fell in love. Their marriage was simple, quiet, built not on wealth, but on trust. Together they created a home. Soon, children followed. 2 little girls who filled their lives with laughter, questions, and constant movement. And as time passed, they learned another child was on the way. But life was not easy. Work was uncertain, money was often tight. Medical needs for their youngest child added to the strain. As the pressure grew, he began to think more and more about returning to a place where he might finally find opportunity. Somewhere he could provide a better life. Somewhere he could be valued for what he knew, not judged for how he looked. That dream led them to the journey they were now on. The Titanic was not supposed to be a place of tragedy. It was meant to be a bridge to a new beginning, a temporary chapter between struggle and hope. And in those first days on the ship, he allowed himself to believe that everything might finally turn out all right. He walked the decks in the early mornings, breathing in the ocean air. He held his daughter's hands as they explored the corridors. He spoke quietly with his wife about what the future might look like, where they might live, what their children might become. He was, at heart, a family man. Everything he did, every decision he made, came back to the same simple purpose: to protect them. On that final evening, he did not know he was only hours away from the most important decision of his life. The ocean remained calm. The sky was clear. The music continued to play. And somewhere, deep inside the ship, time was already beginning to run out. Late that night, when most of the passengers had already settled into their cabins, a strange and unfamiliar feeling moved through the Titanic. It was not loud. It was not violent. It was just a sudden, quiet shudder. A soft vibration passed beneath the floor like the ship had gently brushed against something in the darkness. Glasses rattled faintly. A chair shifted slightly. Then everything went still again. For a moment, it felt like nothing at all. Many passengers barely noticed it. Some turned in their sleep. Others paused in the middle of a conversation, then continued as if nothing had happened. The ship was known to be strong, steady, and safe. No one believed that something serious could be wrong. But in the silence that followed, a feeling began to spread. A quiet uncertainty. In the long hallways of the ship, cabin doors slowly opened. Men stepped out, adjusting their coats. Women looked around with confusion in their eyes. Somewhere, a child began to cry. Footsteps echoed as people leaned into the corridors, asking questions that no one could answer. What was that? Did you feel it? Did something happen? The air felt different now. Colder, tenser. And somewhere, deep inside the ship, water had already begun to pour in. The young father felt it too. He had been awake, resting, but not sleeping deeply. The gentle movement of the ship had become familiar over the past few days, but this was different. There was something in that vibration that made his heart beat faster. Something in the silence afterward that didn't feel right. He sat up slowly, listening. At first, there was only the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway. Then voices. Soft at first, then louder. He stood and moved toward the door, opening it just enough to look outside. Passengers were gathering. Some looked worried. Others looked annoyed, as if they had been disturbed for no reason. A steward passed by, speaking calmly, telling people everything was fine, that it was just a small encounter with ice, that there was no danger. But the father had lived long enough to recognize the difference between calm and forced calm. Something was wrong. He closed the door gently and turned back toward the room. His wife was already awake, sitting up, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. The girls were still asleep, their small bodies curled under warm blankets, unaware of the growing tension beyond the walls. "What is it?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. He listened again. And then, faintly, he heard something else. A distant sound, like water moving. He walked to the beds and gently touched his daughter's shoulders. "Wake up," he said softly. "Put on your coats." There was no panic in his voice, only quiet urgency. Within minutes, more noise began to fill the corridors. Doors opening, people moving faster now, voices raised, questions becoming sharper, more desperate. Outside, the air had turned bitterly cold. When they stepped into the hallway, the tension was unmistakable. Passengers were now being directed upstairs. Some were still calm, trusting the crew. Others were clutching their belongings, their faces pale. "Life jackets," someone said. "Put on your life jackets." The father helped his wife fasten hers. He wrapped the heavy fabric around his daughters, pulling the straps tight. The girls were confused, frightened by the sudden change, by the noise, by the cold. He lifted one child into his arms and took his wife's hand with the other. "Stay close," he told her. And together, they moved with the crowd. The stairs were crowded now, people moving slowly, mothers holding children, elderly couples gripping the railings. The ship no longer felt steady. There was a slight tilt now, so subtle it could almost be imagined. But it was there. When they reached the upper deck, the cold hit them like a wall. The night air was sharp and unforgiving. Breath turned to mist. The stars above looked distant and uncaring, and all around them lifeboats were being uncovered, ropes being pulled, officers shouting instructions. "Women and children first!" The words carried across the deck again and again. At first, many still believed it was just a precaution. Some even laughed nervously. But as time passed, the truth began to settle in. This was not a drill. This was not temporary. Fear began to take hold. Children cried. Women clung to their husbands. Men searched for answers in the faces of the officers, hoping to see reassurance, hoping to see control. But the father didn't look at the officers. He looked only at his family. His wife's hands were shaking now. One of the girls had started crying softly. The other held tightly to his coat, her small fingers gripping the fabric as if she sensed something she could not understand. He knelt down in front of them. "It's going to be all right," he said gently. He didn't know if it was true, but he needed them to believe it. As lifeboats began to lower into the dark water below, the reality became impossible to ignore. There were not enough spaces. People were beginning to understand. Time was running out, and in the middle of the confusion, the noise, and the growing fear, the father remained calm. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because there was only one thing that mattered now: getting his family to safety. By the time the order became clear, women and children first, the cold night air had grown even sharper, and the urgency on the deck had changed from confusion to quiet desperation. Voices were louder now. Officers called out instructions again and again, trying to keep order as passengers gathered around the lifeboats. Some people still stood frozen, unable to believe what was happening. Others pushed forward, afraid there would not be enough room. The young father stood close to his family, one arm around his wife, the other holding his daughter close against his chest. He could feel her small hands clutching his coat. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could feel the fear all around her. His wife's eyes searched his face. She didn't have to ask what he was thinking. They both already knew. A lifeboat nearby was being filled quickly. Crew members were helping women step forward, lifting children over the railings, guiding them carefully into the narrow wooden seats below. "Women and children only," an officer called out. The words carried across the deck like a final line being drawn. For a brief moment, everything seemed to slow. The father looked down at his daughters. He knelt so he could be at their level. The older one was crying now, her small face wet with tears. The younger one was confused, looking from her mother to her father, sensing something was very wrong. He placed his hands gently on their shoulders. "It's going to be all right," he told them softly. His voice was calm, steady. But inside, his heart felt like it was breaking. He lifted the youngest first. She wrapped her arms around his neck without thinking, holding him tightly as he carried her toward the lifeboat. A crew member reached down to take her, helping place her safely inside. Then he turned back for his other daughter. She didn't want to let go of him. She clung to his coat, crying harder now, her small voice rising above the noise of the crowd. He held her close for just a second longer. Then he gently handed her down into the boat, making sure she was seated next to her sister. For a moment, both girls looked up at him together, their eyes filled with fear and trust. Then he turned to his wife. She stepped forward slowly, her hands trembling, one resting protectively over her stomach. The weight of the child she carried seemed heavier in that moment. The wind pulled at her coat, Her face was pale, her eyes shining with tears she was trying not to let fall. He reached for her hand and held it for just a moment longer than usual. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say, a lifetime of words he didn't have time to speak. He wanted to tell her how much he loved her. He wanted to promise he would see her again. He wanted to believe it himself. "Go," he said gently. She didn't move at first. Her fingers tightened around his. The officer called again, more urgently this time.
"There's no time."
The father nodded to her, a quiet, steady nod. She understood. With slow, careful steps, she climbed into the lifeboat, sitting close to their daughters, pulling them both into her arms. The girls pressed against her, still crying, still looking up at their father standing above them. For a moment, everything felt still. The world seemed to shrink down to that one space between them. He forced a small smile, trying to make it look like everything was under control, trying to make their last memory of him a calm one. "I'll see you soon." He didn't know if it was true, but he needed them to believe it. As the crew began preparing to lower the lifeboat, his wife leaned forward slightly. Their eyes met. There was fear in her face, but there was also something else. Trust. The kind of trust that only comes from years of love, of shared struggles, of building a life together one day at a time. She knew what he was doing, and she knew why. He stepped back slowly. One step, then another. The ropes creaked as the lifeboat began to lower. The sound of wood against metal echoed in the cold night air. He moved closer to the railing, watching carefully as the boat descended, his hands gripping the metal edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. His daughters were still looking up at him. He raised his hand and waved. The older one tried to wave back through her tears. The younger one buried her face into her mother's coat. His wife never looked away. Not for a single second. He could see her lips moving. Maybe she was praying. Maybe she was saying goodbye. He would never know. The lifeboat dropped lower and lower until their faces became harder to see, until their voices could no longer reach him, until they disappeared into the darkness below. He stood there long after they were gone, long after the ropes had been pulled back up, long after another group of passengers rushed forward to take the next places. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't look around. He just stood there, staring into the cold, black ocean where the people he loved most were now drifting away from him. For the first time that night, he was completely alone. And in that moment, deep inside, he understood something he had been refusing to accept. He might never see them again. That was the last time his family ever saw him, the last time his daughters looked into his eyes, the last time his wife felt his hand in hers, the last moment they stood together as a family. As the lifeboat drifted farther and farther away into the freezing darkness, the distance between them grew until the great ship blocked their view. The lights of the Titanic still glowed against the night sky, and for a while, it was easy to believe that he was still standing there, watching them, waiting for another chance to survive. His wife held the children close as the small boat rocked gently on the black water. The cold air cut through their coats, and the ocean seemed endless in every direction. Around them, other lifeboats floated in silence, filled with frightened faces staring back toward the ship. Every few seconds, someone would ask the same question. "Do you think they'll be all right?" No one answered. The sounds from the Titanic carried across the water, distant shouts, metal groaning, the sharp crack of something breaking far away. And through it all, his wife kept her eyes fixed on the ship, searching for any sign of him. She believed, at least for a while, that he would find another boat, that he was strong, that he was smart, that somehow he would survive. She whispered his name under her breath, over and over, as if saying it might bring him closer. But as the minutes passed, the tilt of the ship grew more visible, even from a distance. The great vessel that had once seemed so powerful now looked fragile against the dark water. Slowly, the bow dipped lower. The stern rose higher. And then, in a moment that felt unreal, the lights began to flicker. One by one, they went out. The night swallowed the ship. And with it, the man she loved. The screams that followed were something no one in the lifeboats would ever forget. The sound carried across the ocean like a terrible echo. Hundreds of voices calling out at once, desperate, frightened, fading into the cold. She covered her daughter's ears, pulled them tightly against her chest, closed her eyes, and waited for the sound to stop. When silence finally returned, it felt heavier than anything that had come before. Hours later, when the rescue ship arrived and began pulling survivors from the lifeboats, she searched every face she saw, every man who climbed aboard, every figure moving across the deck. But he was not there. She kept looking, through the night, through the early morning light, through the long journey that followed. She never saw him again. In the days and weeks after the disaster, the world became obsessed with the Titanic. Newspapers printed stories from survivors. Lists of the dead were published. Names filled the pages. Accounts of bravery and loss spread across the country. The tragedy captured everyone's attention. But in the middle of all those stories, his name was barely mentioned. He was not a wealthy man. He was not traveling in first class. He was not someone reporters were searching for. And slowly, quietly, his story began to fade. His wife returned home with 2 small daughters and another child on the way. She carried the memory of that night with her for the rest of her life. She worked hard to give her children a future. She spoke of their father with respect, with love, but also with a quiet sadness that never truly left her. Every year, when the date came around, she would grow quiet. She would remember the cold air, the dark water, the moment their hands slipped apart. And she would wonder what his final moments had been like. The children grew up hearing stories about him, about how gentle he was, how hard-working, how he always put his family first. They knew that their father had saved their lives. But outside of their home, the world did not remember. Books were written about the Titanic, films were made. New generations became fascinated with the story. People spoke about the luxury of the ship, the wealthy passengers, the captain, the orchestra. But the young father who stayed behind so his family could live became little more than a name on a long list. Over time, even that name became harder to find. And so, the years passed. Decades went by. The world changed. New tragedies came, new stories filled the headlines. And the memory of that quiet act of sacrifice slipped further into the background of history. But inside one family, the story was never forgotten. His daughters grew older. They carried his memory in the way they lived their lives, in the way they spoke about him, in the quiet pride they felt knowing what he had done. He had not been famous, he had not been powerful, but he had been brave. And sometimes, the bravest stories are the ones the world almost loses. For decades, the world moved on. The Titanic became a legend. Children learned about it in school, books were written, films were made, documentaries filled television screens. People remembered the grand staircase, the orchestra playing as the ship sank, the wealthy passengers, the heroism, the tragedy. But somewhere within all those stories, one quiet sacrifice remained almost completely unknown. The young father who had stood on the deck that night, watching his family drift away to safety. His name appeared only briefly in old records, a line on a list, a name among many. And as the years passed, even that began to fade. The world had not forgotten the Titanic, but it had nearly forgotten him. At home, however, he was never gone. His daughters grew up carrying his memory with them every single day. They remembered the way he spoke gently, the way he protected them, the way he always put family first. The older one held on to small pieces of memory, the warmth of his coat, the sound of his voice, the feeling of his arms lifting her into the lifeboat. The younger one remembered less. She had been too small. But she grew up listening to her mother's stories, listening to the quiet way his name was spoken in the house, listening to the pauses that came whenever that night was mentioned. Their mother never remarried. She devoted her life to raising her children, working, sacrificing, enduring. And every year, when April came, she would grow quiet. She would light a candle, and she would sit alone for a while, remembering the man she had loved, the man who had given his life so she and the children could live. Time moved forward. Years turned into decades. The girls became women. They built lives of their own, families of their own, and the world continued to change around them. But inside them, the memory of that night remained untouched. It was not something they spoke about often, not because they wanted to forget, but because some memories are too heavy to carry in public. Some stories are too painful to repeat. And for a very long time, they kept that story inside the family. Until one day, more than 80 years later, something changed. One of the daughters, now an old woman herself, realized that time was running out. She had lived a full life. She had seen the world change in ways her father could never have imagined. But she also knew something else. If she didn't speak now, his story might disappear forever. The people who had known him were gone. The people who remembered were growing fewer. And the silence that had surrounded his sacrifice for so long was still there. So she made a decision. She would tell the story. Not for fame, not for attention, but for truth. She wanted the world to know who her father was, not just as a name on a list, but as a man, a husband, a father, a man who stood in the cold darkness and chose his family over himself. When she began speaking, the memories came slowly at first, then more clearly. She spoke about her mother, about the journey, about the fear, about the moment she was lifted into the lifeboat. She spoke about her father's calm voice, his steady hands, the way he smiled even when everything around him was falling apart. And for the first time in more than 8 decades, people began to listen. Historians took notice. Researchers began to search through records. And slowly, piece by piece, his story began to return. His name appeared again. His life was remembered. His sacrifice was recognized. And the silence that had surrounded him for so long was finally broken. He was no longer just another passenger. He was no longer just a forgotten name. He became what he had always truly been: a father who made the hardest choice a man can make, a man who gave everything so his children could have a future. For his daughters, it meant something deeply personal. It meant that the world finally understood, finally saw the man they had always known, finally honored the love that had saved their lives. And in the final years of her life, the daughter found a quiet sense of peace, because she knew something important. Her father was no longer forgotten. His story was out in the world. His sacrifice had meaning. And even though he had vanished into the cold waters of the Atlantic that night, the love he left behind had lasted a lifetime. Today, when people speak about the Titanic, they still remember the great ship. They remember the music. They remember the tragedy. But now, they also remember the father who stood on the deck and watched his family drift away to safety. A man who never came home, but whose love carried on through generations. And in the end, that is what matters most. Because ships can sink, time can pass, memories can fade, but a father's sacrifice can live forever.